It was a moment in the 90s when it really felt like something new could happen. Because we were at the end of the Cold War, there was a sense of possibility of doing something different.
We didn't have the internet, so we faxed, we called. There were 40,000 plus women, literally from all over the world. I mean, you couldn't help but be impressed.
The women's movements all came together and began to network. We built a growing understanding that all issues were women's issues, that women had a voice, and violence against women is a human rights issue, which was the work that I had been doing on making women's rights seen as human rights. All of that culminated in 1995 with the Beijing Conference on Women.
The little fires started all over the world, came together in Beijing to make a big bonfire.
There was a sense of purpose, as well as the joyfulness in our being together.
I was a 21-year-old college student. I knew that this is how I would learn. And so I just knew I had to go. For me, the turning point at the conference was when I heard Hillary Clinton give that famous address.
It is a violation of human rights when babies are denied food.
As she got into that litany of human rights violations around the world, you began to see in the audience the sense of their moving into the speech in a very intimate way.
If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
The reaction was extraordinary.
It was something you knew all along, but to have somebody in that position articulate it made it even more important because she educated the rest of the world. I still get emotional when I think about it.
We felt like we were arriving on the world stage, and the world stage was open. It was really the intersection of government with civil society, and there were a lot of women interested in women's empowerment in the private sector also present. We were all sort of saying this is what it would mean for women to be empowered, and the document that resulted is still, I think, a progressive manifesto.
The Beijing Declaration set standards on gender equality for all countries, especially for those countries where there was no visible commitment to gender equality.
It becomes sort of the map for activism on the part of governments and private sector as to what to do going forward.
It was just a growing recognition that if you leave half the population, half the talent pool, half the sort of natural resources of a country, of a community, of a corporation behind, how can you move forward? How can you compete in a global marketplace?
There's been a lot of change as a result of going to Beijing. Women have found a bigger voice, and now they have the courage to speak out.
It's been 25 years since the Beijing Platform. More businesses, more companies are getting engaged in the women's rights and gender equality agenda. While progress is being made, it's simply just not enough.
The pace of change is slow, and it is risking pushing us back and making us lose some of the gains that we have made. We need bold, big, and faster steps.
I think the Fourth World Conference on Women was a milestone moment, but obviously since in the last 25 years things have changed and new technologies have emerged, new issues have emerged.
Statistics tell us that women earn only 1/10 of global income, while they contribute to 2/3 of the entirety of working hours. The gender equality gap will take 257 years to address. This will take private sector taking the lead, but also collaborating with government around policies, collaborating with other stakeholders to ensure that women can truly be equal partners to men.
Women and the economy go together.
What we've seen over the last 20 years is a steady rise in women's entrepreneurship. Women have never been shy to start a business. In the US alone, we see that Black women in particular have created businesses at a rate 3 times our actual share of the population. We have no problem getting started. The problem is actually keeping the doors open and scaling.
Only 2% of venture capital are going to women. So one of the things that these funders really need to do is go out of their way to pull women into the circle. It's making sure you're not funding the same people over and over and over, making sure you're funding people that don't necessarily look like you or are not in the same zip code as you.
We tend to, as humans, stay within our own circles and what we're comfortable with. And quite frankly, investors can be lazy. But I would say they're going to miss out on a ton of amazing companies that are going to be built.
Women have that ability, as small and medium-sized businesses being that critical force in the economy. We need to invest in them.
If women are simply brought up to the level of men in their countries in terms of economic opportunity, we could increase global GDP by $28 trillion by 2025. You can debate emotions and feelings, but you can't debate numbers. They stand for themselves.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of systemic barriers that women experience at work, whether it's harassment and violence or lack of access to affordable childcare. But one of the most challenging barriers is wage discrimination. When jobs that are typically done by women receive a lower wage because they're less valued than the equivalent type of jobs that are done by men.
Women have traditionally played a greater role in caregiving. If someone needs care or if there is an economic difficulty, they are often the first to have to give up or lose their job.
Many women are dropping out of the workforce because often their husbands don't have the option of doing any caregiving, and when there's caregiving to do, it ends up falling to the woman. Caregiving leave has to be gender neutral.
I think it's very important to recognize that having women involved in decision-making results certainly in more inclusive and more sustainable outcomes.
When I first started leading missions, I realized that people frequently asked me whether I was the interpreter. Why did they ask me whether I was the interpreter? And so I realized that being a woman, it means that people do not easily see you to start with, let alone that they see you as the leader. For meetings and missions, I started to wear a colorful jacket, not a black suit. I also started to walk explicitly up front when entering a room. I had to become a little bit a different person, but I have to say they work, which shows again how strong these unconscious biases really are. And I try to convey that also to my colleagues, that in order to overcome or to avoid unconscious biases, you may need to give it an extra push.
Because of the continuation of unequal power in our society, if we want to make sure that men and the organizations that men control don't block change that we need, we've got to engage those men to support women's rights.
There is more external pressure on the companies to promote diversity nowadays.
The leaders in the private sector are recognizing that their business model cannot sustain itself in today's environment. And so they have to do something about it. And so it may be slow, but it has to be sustainable. And in order to have anything sustainable, you cannot isolate women.
There is an important business commitment to make gender equality a reality. The big challenge as we move from awareness raising is about bringing those commitments to the biggest part of the economy, which are SMEs. So collaboration also at that level is absolutely critical.
The private sector has a key role to play in the advancement of gender equality, especially because women's economic empowerment has not been something you can take for granted.
I think that it's wonderful to measure things because what gets measured gets done, and you actually have a lot of transparency then in your company.
UN Women and the Global Compact created the Women's Empowerment Principles 10 years ago. The 7 principles facilitate progress at the workplace, at the marketplace, and in the community. Through the principles, we have been able to engage private sector as a collective.
I've really watched the WEPs grow from an idea to, I think, one of the moving forces in the private sector advancing women's empowerment and gender equality. We've gone from a situation 15, 20 years ago where only a handful of businesses were even interested in this, to a point now today where a business that doesn't get what advancing women and what gender equality can do for it is now seen as a laggard.
We've all got the SDGs out there as our North Star. You can have that goal of number 5, which is gender equality, but that doesn't really tell you how to achieve it. Whereas the women's empowerment principles actually let you think about how to make the change happen across a whole range of measures.
Applying the women's empowerment principles are a matter of smart economy. Governments and companies really have an interest in promoting women economic empowerment because they can achieve better results for everybody.
I started out like many young people on the margins, sort of grabbing the microphone, trying to be heard. I think sometimes when people get discouraged, they don't realize how much has changed. I mean, in the 50 years that I've been an active person, I have seen phenomenal change in the US.
I want young women to understand that their generation is going to need to make gender equity sustainable. So you have to be vigilant.
It's vital to engage youth in the advancement of gender equality, and things like diseases and pandemics, as we're currently experiencing, really brings it to the fore for young people of the potential to envisage a world that looks different.
When I think of inclusion, I think about building bridges in places where we then encourage people to walk across them and feel like they belong. And I think if we could look at inclusion in that way, we're all going to come to the table and be able to make the company or efforts better because we have different understandings of the world. And that is the real key to the inclusion and the diversity pieces. We're not check boxes. We are highly intelligent women who could really be helping companies thrive.
It's not possible to not have equal participation by more than half of the world and hope to drive forward an inclusive and sustainable world and drive forward prosperity. Women's empowerment and indeed gender equality is an all-of-society issue. It's important to ensure that we can get all sectors, all areas of society engaged in addressing this very fundamental challenge.
The glass is more half full than it is half empty, but we've got to fill that glass up. This journey continues.
This is the time for disruptors, young and old. Time for actions to change the course of history for women and girls.
We know the problems, we know the root cause of them, and we also have enough best practices at this point that we really need the rubber to meet the road.